Hello everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Simon's Book Club, where I'll be discussing some of the most interesting books on psychology, neuroscience, communication, relationships, mindfulness, and consciousness. I'm really interested in how the brain works, how consciousness works, how we construct a sense of self, and in how we can live embodied with more compassion, connection, and love. And I hope you're interested in these ideas too. For my last video, I talked about All About Love by focusing on Bell Hooks' All About Love. And in that video, I talked about the different ingredients we need for love as outlined by the author. And those ingredients are care, affection, trust, commitment, respect, recognition, and open and honest communication. Bad joke. That last ingredient is my springboard into this video, as I think nonviolent communication is the open and honest communication that Hooks is talking about. This is how we can talk with love. If you're having difficulty having open and honest communication in being open and vulnerable with others and with being able to connect with people, I really think this book can unlock that for you. Truly, I could say that since I've really incorporated nonviolent communication into my life, I've really felt the quality of my connections with people improve. I've not gotten into the arguments that I used to get into. I've not really left any conversations feeling icky or uncomfortable. Those talks with drunk old white dudes that love conservative political figures don't really hurt me on the inside as they used to. And that's because, here's a big idea, when we're having difficulty communicating with openness and honesty, I think those are the moments that we're speaking with violence. That's when we're disconnecting from compassion to the person that we're communicating with, and we're connecting more with our own pains and our struggles for power and control. Now, this is a pattern that I've noticed. As soon as I say the words violent communication, I often meet resistance. I remember speaking with my parents about nonviolent communication as soon as I got into it, and they immediately tried to distance themselves from the idea of violence. Like, oh no, violent? We're not violent. We just express our opinions. That's not what my parents sound like, by the way. I don't know how to do a Polish accent, but I do know how to do a Vampire Super Mario. The point is, I'm sure there are some of you who would probably say the same thing, who don't think of your language as violent, especially those of you in the YouTube comments section, huh? So I think a really important starting point here isn't to talk about what nonviolence is, but to understand violence first and foremost. So the idea of violence for many is the idea of physical violence in all of its forms of abuse. So for some, violence extends to aggression or shouting and name calling, but I think violence is a lot more subtle than that. The spectrum of violence has a lot more gradient to it, and violence is a lot wider than the most extreme and the most visibly damaging forms of violence that people usually acknowledge. Part of the resistance I face when I talk about violence in communication is a kind of dismissal of anything that doesn't hurt you. If you can't understand how it's hurting you, then it's not violent. It's not that bad, right, Mario? It's me. I'm reminded of some talks I've had with parents who don't view their actions as child abuse because, their parents used to really lay into them. So a little smack here or there isn't that bad, right? Spare the rod, spoil the child. But we all know that this isn't true. And the same can be said about violence here. If you don't think that your violence in language is violent because, a fist, that's violent, then I think you're making similar excuses as abusive parents. So let's try to get to a definition of violence here. According to the World Health Organization, violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. That's a long definition, and not one that I think is really useful for everyday understanding. I think that definition is a good starting point, but it's kind of bloated, and I think that it's lacking something important. It talks about the forms of violence and some of the results of violence, but not the reasons for exerting the violence to begin with. Now, I want to boil this definition down to something a lot easier to remember. And here goes. Violence is the exertion of power to control and coerce, and as a byproduct is damage. In this way, I think it could become more evident how violence shows up in our language. Now let's think about it. How often do we speak with others to try to convince them, to try to change their minds, or to try to show them that they're wrong, or to advise them, or anything? Our violence in language shows up when we're trying to make people change. And I think that idea is going to face resistance, but don't argue against it right away. Please stay open. Just let this simmer in the background. I'm going to elaborate on this while we go back to the book here. I shared my thoughts on violent communication. Now here's what the book has to say about nonviolent communication. In studying the question of what alienates us from our natural state of compassion, I have identified specific forms of language and communication that I believe contribute to our behaving violently towards each other and ourselves. I use the term life-alienating communication to refer to these forms of communication. One kind of life-alienating communication is the use of moralistic judgments that imply wrongness or badness on the part of people who don't act in harmony with our values. Life-alienating communication, however, traps us in a world of ideas about rightness and wrongness, a world of judgments. It is a language rich with words that classify and dichotomize people and their actions. When we speak this language, we judge others and their behavior while preoccupying ourselves with who's good, bad, normal, abnormal, responsible, irresponsible, smart, ignorant, etc. I love that. Rosenberg goes on to say that we have become fluent in a language of criticism, in judgment, evaluations, comparisons, labels, moralizing, blaming, shaming, ideas of who's right and wrong, and especially for those of you who are into Sherlock kind of shows, really into diagnosing others. We are highly proficient in telling people what's wrong with them. And on the flip side, we are barely comfortable, or not at all comfortable, in expressing what's alive in us, what we are feeling, and what needs of ours are unmet. We are very out of touch with our inner feelings and spend most of our words on telling everyone what's wrong with them and what they ought to do. Here's what's wrong with your partner, and here's what's wrong with your brother. Here's what's wrong with your coworkers, your boss, your neighbors, and your president. Here's what's wrong with people that have different values, different sexualities, different ethnicities, political leanings, diets, and body sizes. We talk so much about what's wrong with others. So much. And we could talk about that for hours while talking about what's inside of us. That's tough. Here's Rosenberg again.
Our attention is focused on classifying, analyzing, and determining levels of wrongness, rather than on whether life is being served or not.
In the book, Rosenberg often calls this kind of moralistic judgment life-alienating language because it disconnects us from what's alive inside of us. Even the term what's alive in us is something that I think some of you will resist, as we've been kind of trained to ignore it, to not be seen as too emotional, or to dread being thought of as needy, to look as if we've got all of our shit together, and to often respond to people with, "I'm fine, thank you, and you?" We're guarded, and we've been taught to not open up to others. Oftentimes, we're offensive with violent communication and defensive in hiding our vulnerabilities, feelings, and needs. Rosenberg says that our tendency to judge people is a tragic expression of our feelings and needs, because whenever we speak with people in judgmental terms and tell people what's wrong with them and what they should do, well, most people don't just smile and take it with grace and follow all of the unsolicited advice that you've offered. No matter how right we think we are, no matter how spot on we think our criticism may be, no matter how helpful we think we're being, I just really haven't encountered anyone gracefully listening to people tell them what they need to change. Nobody I know ever really likes this shit. And this is why violent communication is tragic. If you want someone to change and you're trying to get them to change through violence, you're not going to get the result that you're hoping for. Even if you can coerce someone into doing what you want them to do, it comes at the cost of psychological pain and damage. And to me, the ends do not justify the means. It's not worth the price you pay. Now, this isn't my idea here. It comes from the book as well, though it's said with less passion and this kind of save the world bemoaning tone that I'm adopting for some reason here. Let's go back to Rosenberg's happy voice.
2 questions help us to see why we are unlikely to get what we want by using punishment to change people's behavior. The first question is, what do I want this person to do that's different from what he or she is doing? If we ask only this question, punishment may seem effective because the threat or exercise of punitive force may well influence the person's behavior in ways we want. However, when the second question is asked, it becomes evident that punishment isn't likely to work. The second important question is this: what do I want this person's reasons to be for doing what I'm requesting? We seldom address the latter question, but when we do, we soon realize that punishment and reward interfere with people's ability to do things motivated out of a desire to enrich life for themselves and others. I believe it's critical to be aware of the importance of people's reasons for behaving as we request. For example, blaming or punishing would obviously not be effective strategies if we want children to clean their rooms out of either a desire for order or a desire to contribute to the parents' enjoyment of order. Other children clean their rooms motivated by obedience to authority. Because my mom said I had to. They respond out of avoidance of punishment, fear of feeling guilty if they don't, fear of rejection if they don't. Nonviolent communication, however, fosters a level of moral development based on autonomy and interdependence, whereby we acknowledge responsibility for our own actions and our awareness that our own well-being and that of others are one and the same.
Do we really want people's reasons for doing something to be because of fear of punishment, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of your disappointment and anger and unkindness? I don't think we want fear of any sort to be people's motivating factor. I believe we'd all be happier if people's motivations was the inherent joy in their hearts because they'd love to contribute to your well-being, to your society's well-being, rather than to avoid your violence. Violence in communication is us trying to use force and power to control others. And truly, that's not the kind of world we want. It's not the world you want. We can't keep trying to shape the world through coercion, through disciplinary actions and punishment and exile and fear and deprivation. We can't keep trying to rule with an iron fist. We don't like dictators and governments, yet we keep dictating how others should act in our circles. There are many movements now that speak up against violence. You might have heard the phrase, "speak truth to power." So I think we can speak about the power dynamics at play when we use violent language against each other, and to speak to how we distance ourselves from love, connection, and community when we do so. Power is gained through violence. And if you're using violence against violence, what results do we expect? We want to shape the world so that the old power structures don't keep us suffering and underprivileged, that don't marginalize everyone except for old rich men and their interests. Yet, with violence in our communication, we're perpetuating the pattern. When we're speaking out against the game by playing along with the game, we're not going to get out of the game. An eye for an eye keeps the whole world blind. And I've got tons of more trite quotes if you want them. We can affect greater change through compassion and love. And we all know this already. This message isn't new to me. It's thousands of years old. I'm sure you've heard it before in one song or another, or in one religion or another, or in one pillow sham at your aunt's house or another. Yet I think most of us aren't really convinced by the idea of living a life of love and compassion, and find it too fluffy, or simply believe that it's not how the world works. And I agree, the world doesn't work with love as its core ethic yet. But I think that we could get there, and I'd rather be part of the solution than perpetuating the problem. We can affect change within our close circles by refusing to use violent communication against our families, our friends, our loved ones, and even ourselves, as we've internalized violence in our language so deeply that we brutalize ourselves with phrases of what we should be, about how we're failing, what we don't like about ourselves, how we're not as good as others. Self-love is so difficult for so many, and we're not kind and gentle to ourselves, and we don't love and accept ourselves just as we are. And beyond the people that we love, we can also offer nonviolent communication to the people that we disagree with. Now, I'm going to leave this off with my favorite part of the book. It really wasn't until I read this story that everything kind of clicked for me. I'll share it here. For a bit of context, Marshall Rosenberg was Jewish and experienced a lot of violence as a child because of people hating him for his heritage. Now here's a story.
Over the last 30 years, I've had a wealth of experience sharing nonviolent communication with people who harbor strong beliefs about specific races and ethnic groups. Early one morning, I was picked up by a cab at an airport to take me into town. A message from the dispatcher came over the loudspeaker for the cabbie. "Pick up Mr. Fishman at the synagogue on Main Street." There was another man sharing the cab with me, and he muttered, "These get up early in the morning so they can screw everybody out of their money." For 20 seconds, there was smoke coming out of my ears. In earlier years, my first reaction would have been to want to physically hurt such a person. Now I took a few deep breaths, gave myself some empathy for the hurt, fear, and rage that were stirring inside of me. I listened to the feelings, but then I stayed conscious that my anger wasn't coming from what my fellow passenger nor the statement he had just made. Rather, I realized his comment had triggered off a volcano inside of me. I could see that my anger came from a deeper source than the judgment that made me angry. Giving myself this empathy enabled me then to focus my attention on the humanness behind his message. I wanted to see the beauty in him, to understand what was alive in him when he made that remark. I also wanted him to understand me and the pain that I felt, and I trusted that he would be better able to do that if he felt that I empathically connected with what was going on in him when he said what he did. I said, "Are you feeling frustrated because you have some needs that haven't been met when you've dealt with money with Jewish people?" He thought about that for a moment and said, "Yeah, these people are disgusting. They'll do anything for money." And he continued to release more judgments as I listened for the feeling and need behind each one. When we settle our attention on other people's feelings and needs, we experience our common humanity. When I hear that he's scared and wants to protect himself, I recognize that I have the need to protect myself at times. I know what it's like to be scared. So when my consciousness is focused on another person's feelings and needs, I see the universality of our experience. I had a major conflict with what went on in his head, of course. But I've learned that I enjoy human beings more if I don't get caught up in what they think in such situations. I've learned to savor life much more by only hearing what's going on in their hearts and not getting caught up with what's in their head.
I was very moved when I heard this story. Truly. That last line is huge. I've learned to savor life much more by only hearing what's going on in their hearts and not getting caught up with the stuff in their heads. Life feels a lot better when we connect with what's alive in people. On the flip side, life is kind of shitty when we get caught up with what's in people's heads, our own included. That's a basic principle right here. That's a big rule of life. This is the shit that I'd want to say to my grandkids if I ever have them. I think I might need to have kids first. Can't I just adopt a grandkid? The point is, we can hold space for the people in our communities who are dealing with their own shit, who are probably the victims of one flavor of abuse or neglect or another, who have been fed some kind of programming and conditioning that we know isn't necessarily kind or compassionate, but they're still doing their best and trying to survive all of this weird shit. If they've got ideas that don't jive with yours, then just cut them some slack. We don't have to wait for perfect people to offer love. Everyone deserves it unconditionally. And we don't have to be perfect to receive love either. You deserve it too, unconditionally. I gotta admit, I'm feeling challenged in talking about this here because internet commentary is so full of shaming and judging and severely lacking compassion that I'm not sure if this message can be received. I feel like I'm going to a steakhouse and asking people to just eat the salads and to turn vegan, or going to a gun show and asking people to disarm. Coming to YouTube and trying to talk about nonviolence, especially with the kind of reception that I've been getting lately, seems kind of like a "you came to the wrong hood, motherfucker" kind of scenario. I think it's partly because the internet can be empowering to people who have difficulty exerting power away from the computer. And for me to ask people to feel less power by embracing nonviolence is going to face strong resistance. Power can be intoxicating. I get it. I do. But I'll still say this as my main selling point. Violence does not feel as good as compassion. Engaging with online violence is very stressful, I've found, both as a sender and a receiver of it, and damaging to the people you're directing your violence towards. Kindness is always available. And once you start participating in kindness, I think you'll feel less pain. Truly. I need Rick James to come here and say, compassion is a hell of a drug. I love your couch. I hope you're old enough to get that reference. Okay, so I'll just repeat how I got here because we've gone a bit far from what the book is talking about. Now, this is a book on nonviolent communication. So I tried to define violent communication, and then I offered a definition that I think makes sense. And then I tried to show how the definition of violence fits in with Rosenberg's idea of nonviolence. And I think they do fit. Now, all of this leads to me asking people to be mindful of the violence of their words, and it leads to me hoping that we can all come to a place where kindness is our default. Now that we've got this far, there are some resistance points that I could see popping up, and the first one being freedom of speech claims. And I think this idea of nonviolent communication will come across as policing your language, and I'm not here for that. You're free and you have the power to say whatever you want. I'm just trying to speak truth to that power and trying to raise awareness of how language can be violent and trying to share a different approach with nonviolent communication. I know that freedom of speech issues are a hot topic in America right now as people like Kanye West are communicating damaging violence to a large audience, and figuring out what to do with that is challenging. Now, to that I'll say, you have the right to own guns, but you don't have the right to shoot people. And you have the right to practice martial arts, but you don't have the right to knock people out in the streets. Many countries have defamation laws so that you can't damage someone's right to a livelihood. So where to draw the line for where violence begins to be punishable by law is something that I do not want to begin to suggest. And that's mostly because I believe in restorative justice, which isn't something that most governments practice. The laws as we have them right now are most often enforced through violence. So I'm not suggesting any policy changes at a governmental level or institutional level for new ways to punish people. That's not what I'm here for. What I'm suggesting instead, on a personal level, with your friends and your family and yourself and with your community and with the internet as well, I ask that you practice empathy and compassion and abstain from violence. Now, if you feel that this is tone policing, again, I'm not telling you how to speak. I'm not speaking about what you should do. If you feel that speaking with violence is how you can best achieve your goals and that it's worth the damage and the side effects that it causes for whatever reasons you have of righteous indignation or desire for revenge or just plain old intolerance of ideas that don't align with yours, that's your choice. You have the freedom and the power to use whatever tone you want. I just don't think that violence is going to get you your desired outcome and will result in feeling unsafe and disconnected. I think there are better ways to achieve your goals, and nonviolence is the way. The second objection I see people arguing is that nonviolence only allows for compliments and toxic positivity, and that isn't the case either. Violent communication isn't only about punishing people who are stepping out of line, but also for rewarding people who are staying in line. Violence doesn't just punish divergence, violence also reinforces normativity. If our compliments are about people doing the right thing, of being a good girl or a good worker or a good son or good student or a good citizen or a good man, whatever we believe that to be, then we're still perpetuating the violence of those moralistic judgments. If you disagree with nonviolent communication or with some of the ideas that I share here, I'd love to hear about it. I want to be challenged in all that I know, and I'd be really interested in seeing where you disagree and what blind spots I'm missing here. But please, do so nonviolently. Please imagine that real human beings read your comments. I read your comments. My mom reads your comments. My friends do, except for Brian, and causing violence hurts all of us. It isn't the way. I'm okay with disagreeing. I have friends I disagree with over topics that we discuss kindly and for a long time. If you want me to change something, these old ways of violence aren't the answer. compassion and kindness is. If you want to know more about how to speak with nonviolent communication, there is a 4-step process, and that's what the majority of the book focuses on. I'll go over that in my next video on my own channel, Simon's Book Club. I know I spent a lot of time telling you here not to use violence, but that's just me telling you what not to do, and it's very hard for us to do a don't. For our needs to be fulfilled and for our requests to be understood, it's helpful for people to know what specific action we're asking for rather than for what we're asking them to avoid. So if you'd like to connect and to leave a comment that doesn't cause harm and damage, and you're not sure about how to speak with nonviolent communication, please watch the next video. It's a very useful guide. I think you'll like it. I've created a Discord server where kindness and nonviolence and compassion is a default mode of many. And after my last video on All About Love, we got a lot of new people, all of whom are very lovely and who are connecting with compassion and really engaging in some beautiful ideas. Now, if this kind of stuff interests you and you're looking for a community of people who participate in nonviolence, come join us. I'd love to hear how you're getting through all of this weird shit. I know this message won't be received well by all of you. It won't even be well received by many of you. But I think there are some of you who understand what I'm getting at. So if you like these videos, I ask that you consider supporting me on Patreon. I've got many ideas along these lines that I want to share, many more books that I want to dig deep into, with a message that I think can have a healthy impact. We've all known violence, and we see it around us all the time, on screens, around our families and friends, and in the places we work. So let's shed some light on what it would mean to embody compassion. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.